Well, most of my documentaries come out of my work as a psychologist and an academic, and I'm interested in stressful jobs carried out on the social margins, what anthropologists call liminal spaces, spaces of challenge, transition, and controversy. And certainly the work of your work as movement lawyers and climate activists are certainly engaged in that type of work, labor that involves more than what meets the eye. And as a documentarian, I try to both support projects that I care about, but also demand something of the audience to think more deeply about a social problem. And the Climate Defense Project for me was an ideal subject because these are thoughtful people doing difficult work, in some ways on the margins of the law. It's a courageous story that involves defending activists engaged in civil disobedience, which is itself an important part of our history of the use of the law in movements for social change.
The reason we got started at Climate Defense Project is that we don't have enough lawyers working in direct collaboration with people on the front lines. And a lot of what we've done so far is to advise and defend folks who have been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. And typically these are people who are resisting the construction of fossil fuel infrastructure like pipelines, often in their own communities or regions. Unfortunately, elected officials are still greenlighting these projects, especially under Trump, but we all know that Democrats often support them as well. And as we saw in the film, the climate impacts are not even the full story because fossil fuel pollution also creates health burdens on communities of color and poor communities. These are the people bearing the brunt of the impacts. And it makes COVID-19 worse and other respiratory illnesses worse as well. So as the film highlights, a special focus of our work has been to take cases to trial, to use what's called the necessity defense. And in case anyone watching this hasn't seen the film, basically the necessity defense is a legal argument that, in certain circumstances, the harm caused by lawbreaking, whether it's simple trespass or something more serious, can actually be outweighed by the harm that it was trying to prevent, and can therefore be legally excusable. The classic example of this is breaking down a door in order to save a baby in a burning building, right? It's a pretty common sense argument. It's been around for hundreds of years, but political protesters started using the necessity defense in the 1970s during the Vietnam War. And in the last 10 years or so, climate activists have used it as well. So the main function of the necessity defense in a criminal trial is to kind of give the jury a broader context for deciding a person's guilt than just the bare facts of the case, or the who, what, when, where, why. It's something that allows a protest defendant to put a spotlight on the harmful practices that led to the protests in the first place. And I think most jury members, when they hear a necessity defense, do appreciate having that context. There's something maybe a bit paternalistic about the idea that, jury members can't be trusted with those extra facts or can't be trusted to weigh the evidence properly. But there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting recognition for the necessity defense in the courts. We've had some important victories, but it's still extremely common for judges to exclude or throw out these defenses before the trial begins and before the jury hears them. Part of our advocacy at CDP has been to broadcast the message that nonviolent civil disobedience can be effective, right? If it's nonviolent and if it's choreographed well, it can both galvanize public opinion against particular harms like pipelines or police brutality. And it can also just help change the narrative about what exactly is the crisis we're facing and like whose lives are disposable. I think it's also important to remember that civil disobedience is not a new tactic. Pretty much every successful social movement in modern history has used it.
We entered a block valve site just outside of Grand Rapids, Minnesota, and line 3 and 4 ran into that site. And it was actually line 4 that we addressed. So we cut the lock and the chain entered into the site. We brought another lock, replaced their lock with another one and locked ourselves in. And then we began to live stream, and we immediately called the emergency number that was on the fence at the entrance to this site to inform them of our intentions, that we were there to begin the process of shutting down line 4 manually, because we felt it was necessary because of the grave danger that people are facing with this pipeline coming through. And also line 4, we wanted to address line 4 because we didn't want to make this about one particular pipeline. This is about a very large climate crisis. There are 6 lines that run through this area. And so we didn't want it to look like we were focusing just on this one line 3, which is getting a lot of attention, continues to get a lot of attention. Anyhow, we encouraged them to remotely shut it down because we knew that they could when we called them, and we knew that they would do that in the best way possible. And then we began preparing the valve itself for being turned, and we hung our banners. And we had a number of sacred objects with us that were sent to us from people from all different faith and spiritual traditions. We didn't tell them what we were going to, specifically what we were going to do with them, but we told them that if they could, to please put prayers in those objects, and that we would be bringing those prayers to a site that was in great need of prayer. Then they shut it down remotely, particularly when we're dealing with issues that are life-threatening, like the climate crisis, and then the fossil fuel industry that exacerbates the climate crisis. So we're quite, we're in a very life and death situation with this. But what shaped the action for me was a very poignant moment that I had with Deb Topping, who is in the film. We attended a series of Public Utilities Commission hearings down in St. Paul, and they were at the point where they were going to make the decision about the route, where this expanded line 3 project would go. They had already gotten their certificate of need. And so as they were making this decision, they had graphs up and stuff, and I was sitting next to Deb, and she said, "What are you hearing?" And she was like looking off in the distance and crying. And I said, "It's not good, Deb. It looks like they're gonna route it right through Fond du Lac." And she said, "Stop talking," and I did. And then I asked her why, and she said, "Because I don't want the ancestors to hear." And I thought, this is really deep here, and that's what began to shape like an idea in my mind, like what could I do that the ancestors would want to hear and see.
I think another point of commonality between the climate and racial justice movements is that, just as I said, there's a lot of distrust of both the government and the police. And I think people from a range of social movements are kind of converging on this feeling that our government doesn't work for us anymore. But for some people, it never has worked for them, right? It was never designed to work for them. And those are the people who should be leading these fights. But there's still a lot of work to be done in actually putting that into practice.